prayer list? You know how you took care of that, put a new one in when you come on Wednesdays?
Oh, yeah, sure.
It's only one piece of paper left, right?
Well, that,
But I'll get you a new one.
We don't have a lot to pray about. Here's 8 pieces of paper.
well, no, that's funny because that's how long it's been.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I was gonna do before the bottom fell out
Get a
was
new
go over and
tablet.
get a new tablet. So it's probably last February sometime along the line.
So, Teresa, you're wearing a leprechaun hat, green socks, green. I don't think I'm wearing anything green. I get pinched, right?
That's what they say.
Does being married to an Irish woman matter? Do I get
She
any
could be
credit?
the one to pinch you.
I didn't even think about that. I just put that on.
Man, you're lucky. Today is
Once
my
a year.
son-in-law's birthday. Happy birthday,
birthday.
Andrew. He
Nice.
is always on St. Patrick's Day. So,
My grandson birthday's today. Happy birthday, Austin.
all right, Austin. How old's Austin?
14.
I think Andrew's like, oh, he's getting really old. He's a runner, and one time we went and let him off for the start of a race and came back at the end of the day. He ran 100 miles in the mountains. And it was like, you ran 100 miles non-stop. And he wasn't the only one. There were like dozens and dozens and
Others with
dozens
him.
of these people. And it's like, holy cow. And he's done it since high school. So, well, we are coming toward the end of this study. We are in part 8 already, which we probably got here earlier than we should have. Last week we talked a little bit about the intertestamental period, the part 7 yearning into part 8, and we got to Zechariah and Mary and John, the son of Zechariah. So, I'm going to crawl forward a little bit here with Andrew, Mary, and Simon Peter. If we run out of the book, we'll spend the last session boning you guys up on Phil Carey because he's coming on the 18th. So, now the trouble that I have with this section is this is such a familiar story, and so I kind of like start to reading, and what did you pick up on?
Well, yeah, it was a familiar story. I guess I liked the more visual imagination on the pulling, the unexplainable pulling of why they wanted to follow Jesus.
Okay.
I thought that was explained pretty neat, and the eyes. Yeah. It's just exactly how I've imagined.
When I was in college, in our group, a good friend, Joe Murphy, had these eyes, and the girls went nuts for Joe and his eyes.
Yeah.
He's out there somewhere. Last I heard, he was an executive at FedEx Express, but eyes are an amazing insight.
I hope I have the right chapter. John the Baptist.
Yeah, we're moving
Yeah,
in
we were
that part.
32 to
Zechariah, Mary,
36.
John the Baptist.
What really hit me was
35.
the importance of, and it's been this way, but this really enforced it for me, was John, son of Zechariah, and his mother, the history. That was, when you said that, the introduction was, well, he's John, son of Zechariah. And it was like, what's that? What, like, let's say Ted, son of Larry. Who cares? But back in those days, you could trace, you automatically knew who these people were. That told you, I think it was Sunday, that John the Baptist, I think, brought back the type of, in my mind all these years, the type of religious, I hate to use the word zealot. No deals. This is how it is.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I'm here. And he sums it up with, he is the voice. So what I'm telling you is, this is it. And what I really liked about the end of it, and then the story hit me, is when he calls out the king for taking his son's wife and says, even though you were sitting here and I'm in the valley, my voice got to you and will get to you. And he spoke that out, and then of course, her name was
Herodias.
Yeah.
Herodias.
his daughter,
Oh, Salome.
Salome, because I used to always call it Salome, Salome, and she unfortunately wanted him because I guess, well, you know, the bottom line is you're calling out the king, and everybody in the world is like standing downtown. Hey, by the way, the governor, you know, and you let this cut loose, and you don't get away with that back in those days. And she used that influence because she did this dance for this king and what have you, and she had him beheaded, which was a terrible thing. But the thing that I liked about him in general was just that he was no pansy. The guy was hardcore to the max. When I lived in the wilderness, didn't have any support, no backing, no whatever. And it just, it's so different than a lot of the preaching you hear today, especially on television, the feel-good type ministry and everything else, where everything is all rosy and perfect and whatever else. Sometimes you need a guy like him around. That's just my opinion. I'm more into that type of an individual.
Well, they're clear cut.
You know
And it's
exactly.
like, so what's John about? Don't have to think hard, you know. He's pretty straight up. You said a couple of things like the popularity. That's always been a piece. We just had a text a couple of weeks ago where Jesus starts. You know, he comes into. I want to say Capernaum. I may have that wrong, but he does all these healings, and this guy's let the guy through the roof of Peter's house, and you know, that had to be exciting. I mean, in a world with no medicine at all and no support of any kind, a guy that can simply touch you or look at you or speak a word and deadly diseases go away, and you're like the ruler of the synagogue whose daughter actually died and Jesus raised her from the dead. It's like unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
It would be absolutely sensational if it happened in the lobby of Lancaster General, where there are a lot of medical miracles. And so Jesus' response to this wildly enthusiastic, fired up crowd is he gets up before the sun in the morning, sneaks off to a quiet place and is praying, and Peter and the boys come looking for him. It's like, what are you doing out here, man? You got a crowd down here, and you know, this is where the action is. This is where you're going to build this program, and blah blah blah. And he goes, nah, I didn't come for that. I came, and he walks off.
Mm-hmm.
And he did that repeatedly, and one of them is really very telling. Is he talks about almost openly who he is and what he's doing, and a prediction of the cross and so forth, and then he gets into the bread of heaven talk and says, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you do not have life within you, which sounds remarkably like cannibalism. And a bunch of people were offended and left. And he turns to Peter and he goes, aren't you going to leave too? It's like kind of daring. Peter's response was, where are we going to go? You're the one with the words of eternal life. And Jesus is pretty clear about if you're going to be my disciple, you're going to pick up your cross and follow me. You're going to go where I go. You're going to do what I do. And he's not interested in building a program or drawing a crowd. And it makes you kind of step back and say, okay, what's the church doing? You know, we're so worried about, Ted and I were just talking about decisions made in the congregation based on social status and longevity, and I told him what you and I talked a little bit about in terms of when we prayed, we had homeless women and Hispanics coming in the door, and that's an answer to the prayer, like, this is what I want here. And the question is going to be, can the congregation jettison its past and embrace Jesus' future? And if they will not, he's not going to be paralyzed.
No.
It's like,
You remember, I'm sorry, you remember a statement, I don't know whether you heard it, I heard it, when it was first made here. Well, try to be as easy about this.
you're live.
Well, that's
Don't use
fine,
bad words.
but, no, but anyway, without even, I don't have, the name of the person is really not important, but I happened to be sitting in the back of the church, and an individual made a comment one day. This was a few years back. He said, if they don't change in here, this place is gonna be a museum. And that stuck in my mind, because they just said it just came right out. If it doesn't change, this will be a museum. And at that time, this was before our last pastor, and this has been that long ago. It's been 8, 9 years. But that stuck in up there. And I see some of it, and things that I used to look at, that you have what I call the established hierarchy and stuff over the years, that things were done repeatedly a certain way because of this person, and that person. And I know that they meant well. I do not dispute that in any way, shape, or form. But it's like everything that I've seen over the years. The building has always been the building. And for some reason, they have become attached to what was and what is, because this is what they know in this area. And people have a resentment of change. And I used to pretty much like that too. I used to believe in the old ways. And a lot of times I'll run into people and say, and you're still talking about stuff that you did 35, 40 years ago. Nobody wants to hear that anymore. And this, I think, is one of the keys that kind of is hung on in here and stuff, because you'll hear it at times during the holidays, and once again, people will come up and say, well, why do we do certain things this way? And it was because, well, this person did it this way. That doesn't mean that there weren't other ways to do things, or not. I don't want to use the word better, but just ways of doing things. One of the small things that I saw here a few years ago at Easter, one of the women came in, and I had never seen this done here. Everything was always decorated the same way until this Good Friday. And somebody had come in and rearranged flowers in the shape of a multicolored cross on the steps going up to the altar. It wasn't, people didn't come in and say, why did they do this? The response was, man, that really looks great. And that's how it was. But somebody had to do that and make that small change that was not the repetitive, like, well, we do this every year, we hang this here, and this here. Why did we do that? Because it's the way it's always been done. This is 2021, we can't always do the things we used to do. And I'm more or less like, you have to plan ahead for the future. And it's tough breaking some of those things, and a lot of times you hear, sometimes you, and I know this will probably come back to bite me, but sometimes you might as well just I always say, bring that cinder block along with you and start beating your head on it, because that's about how far you're going to go. A lot of good intentions, but us and a lot of other churches here in this town, or if they haven't seen it yet, they have, and they just didn't see the big picture. But they're going to have to do some changing and stuff like this to advance into the future if they expect to have one.
Yeah, and tying it back into the book, the people of the time, they were pretty hard pressed. There's no medicine, there's no social services network. The Romans are a conquering entity that wants to make money off of its conquered territories, unlike the United States that seems to conquer in a war and then lose money for 60 years afterwards. The people are trying to get some stability, and that looks like predictability. So when you have a group of people, if it's just one person, they can do whatever they want whenever they want. If it's two, you have to start talking about it, and it's relatively easy. Like if you think of a married couple when they first get married, it was not that way for Teresa and I. We did great. I mean, we'd known each other for a number of years and had already been establishing patterns on stuff, and we didn't have a hard time the first year at all. But you do run into things like in the marriage counseling where Christian couple, it's Christmas Eve, when do you go to church? And some families go to church and then eat, others eat and then go to church. Some of them have a love affair with the midnight mass, which the older I get, the more I hate. Just, it's too much. And especially since somebody shows up on Christmas morning. Do you go to church on Christmas morning? And then there's the whole business of presents. Do you open any, one, some, all on Christmas Eve? It's like there's no right or wrong answer on any of those kinds of things, but what did you grow up with? That's normal for you. And anything that's not normal is abnormal, and abnormal is wrong. I'm right, you're wrong. You get some of that.
Yeah.
So you start having to communicate and establish patterns, and patterns give stability and predictability, and you get that going in a town or a county or a country, and people are trying to keep it together so that their income keeps coming in and the mail keeps being delivered, and there's expectations, and then you get, like religiously, an expectation. There's this emerging hope of resurrection from the dead that slowly starts showing itself in the religion of Judaism. It starts coming up in the Psalms and hints here and there, and along with that, a sense of God's redemption. It's not happening in time, so it's got to happen beyond time, and the hope of redemption and the Messiah to do it, and all of these things are converging and slowly developing in the society, and they have it all worked out that the only way that God could possibly do all of these things is to have a David-like military conquering singer with beautiful wavy hair, so girls like it, and all those things that were David. And then Jesus comes along, and we have no idea what he looked like. There's a prophecy in Isaiah that says that there was nothing about him that made us notice him. So I'm thinking, kind of an average looking guy, but his idea of Messiah is very different than, say, Peter's. And that's a real, like, somebody throwing cold water in your face. And Peter's got this whole, Luther would have called it a theology of glory kind of view of Messiah. And then Jesus comes along with a theology of the cross view of the Messiah, that he has to do this dirty work that needs done of saving people, being the propitiation for their sin, and keeps going the cross, and the cross is ugly. Nowadays we have a beautiful one on the altar, and I saw one of the women in the congregation on Sunday had a very delicate, beautiful gold cross necklace, and you see the cross that way a whole lot more than that way. And one time when I was in the Army, there was an accident, and it was with ammunition trucks, and there were several casualties, and somebody came running into our firing position asking for help. We went down there and trying to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on a guy who had been vomiting, and there were so many flies that you couldn't get a good seal. Not like my first aid classes when I was a Boy Scout. It was awful. It was hot, and there was fires, and I trying to organize fire detail and first aid, and the medevac helicopter started coming in, and dust swirling all over the place, and it's like that's a whole lot different than anything I ever expected. And Jesus is that realistic. It's like going to the cross. There's a guy named John Dominic Crozon, I think. He's a peer and contemporary with N.T. Wright and so forth, and he's a good historian, and he says, in history you're trying to figure out the most likely thing to have happened, and Jesus going to the cross, if it was anybody other than Jesus, they would have been strung up and picked apart by birds and prey and dogs and thrown into the garbage when they were dead. And he paints what I think is probably the normal thing for like the other two guys that were crucified at the same time as Jesus. Jesus is different because of, he had people that, that he was not unattached. His mother was there, his disciples and men of power and influence like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and so his story would have been different even if he didn't raise from the dead. There were people that that were willing to risk their reputations in order to be loyal to him. That's not, it's like, that's not the Messiah of glory. And yet, people like John Ben Zebedee look at it and they see what's really going on there and understand what Jesus had been talking about, and then what he did, and then he's vindicated on Easter Sunday. But that expectation that goes so contrary to what everybody's worked out, and they can't help it, they work it out for their own sake. Like, for example, get somebody talking about winning the lottery. They don't give a dime to the church now, they've got a steady income, and they're going to win the lottery, and then all of a sudden they're going to be generous. It's like, no, you're not.
That's a good point, yeah.
He who's faithful in little things is faithful in much. It's like if you've got somebody that, it's like I've seen them. They're disciples of Jesus. They're kind of simple, straightforward people. They graduated from high school. They got a job, and they are, able to have a home, and they're working to hold that, and they tithe. And then I see these people with, they live in Bent Creek and they don't give a dime, and, the widow's money, that the Messiah is in this world, and his redemption's in this world. You said something I wanted to go back to. It's part of this expectation thing. It's like, how can Jesus be attractive? You know, like, does wandering make him a compelling, attractive figure who is speaking to the deep issues that people are asking? Does he get that developed in this book? Like, does Jesus matter?
Yes, yeah. But where I felt it mattered more was through the disciples.
Okay.
That's where I was feeling it come through, because I think it might have been Andrew who was just like couldn't explain why he was pulled
Okay.
to his master. You know, he left John to follow Jesus, and
With John's permission, but
with John's permission, that is correct. But just I felt it. You know, that feeling that he had. He was telling his brother, I'm following this guy. You know.
yeah. I was rereading that this morning, and he has Peter going, I like John. I didn't get it,
Right,
a lot
right.
of it, but I followed him for a year just like you did.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a personal concern of mine is Harvey Cox at Harvard's the guy that had the funny thing about the rapture, where one of his students says, what's the rapture? You know, the fundamentalist idea that all the Christians get pulled out before it gets too hard. And Harvey said to the class, the rapture is when you look out the window and you see these random people being pulled up into the sky, and you think, I'll be damned. I think that's the funniest thing.
That is funny.
But Harvey Cox said one time, somebody said, Jesus is the answer, and he goes, okay, but what's the question? And I think the attractiveness of Jesus, you know, that's a burden of preaching, and it's maybe why I feel it. It's like,
Yeah.
I feel like in our society, the electronic mass media has created this environment where the people are so distracted from what used to be the major questions of life that, you know, they're worried about Candace Owens and Cardi B having a fight. Or here's one, Americans worrying about Prince Harry and why his GoFundMe page didn't raise $14 million. You know, it's like, we threw those bums out, and she was a C-list actress. She's cute, but so's pretty much any woman with estrogen. So what's the deal? And we're getting hours and hours of coverage for a couple spoiled brats that are having a tiff because daddy won't give them more money in the allowance.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, there's 100,000 people who've been arrested at the border, probably 300,000 more that got through without being detained. A sample testing shows a significant amount of COVID, and then the reality that we're bringing in literally hundreds of thousands of people who are going to end up on the public assistance, at least for a while, in a country that's $20 trillion in debt. It's like, where are we going to get the money to take care of these folks? You know, it's like, I'm big into immigration, but everything costs money. Why aren't we talking about the border? Why aren't we talking about the taxes? Why aren't we talking about the guy wasn't this really bugged me that, you know, the Portland and Seattle and Chicago and, you know, those, the federal government only really got involved when they tried to burn down the federal courthouse. The rest of the time it's like, hey, Portland's a municipality, and unless they ask for help, we can't come in. And then you get the same thing at the Capitol, and that's a different issue. You know, one report is there was a group of people who built a scaffold and had the plastic handcuffs and were looking for Nancy Pelosi because they wanted to hang her. That's a problem, okay?
Yeah.
Why aren't we looking at that systematically? Yesterday, and I'm not sure how this works, Guam is a U.S. trust territory, so it falls under the sovereignty of the United States, but it's like more like Puerto Rico than a state. So apparently they have an elected representative who's stationed in Washington, D.C., who is a liaison between the government in Guam and the Congress. And one of the senators said, or it was in a defense budget conversation about involving the National Guard and so forth, and she said something like, Guam's not really even a part of the United States. So the guy gets a bunch of people from Guam who are in the National Guard in uniform going down the hallways of the Senate office building and into her office. Now, he brought a gift and food and National Guardsmen because he wanted to give them a chance to educate this senator on, you know, we are part of the United States and we have all these people who for generations have been serving in the armed forces, and, you know, I get that, and I don't think there was any malicious intent, but at the end of the day, there's a thing called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and one of the overriding principles is you're apolitical. You do not show up, if you're on active duty or on reserve rosters, you do not show up at political events in uniform as if you're representing whatever branch of service you happen to be in. And quite frankly, in terms of a technical violation of the law, those soldiers in uniform hunting down a U.S. senator in the Capitol building is just as big a deal as what happened on the 6th of January this year. You know, it's like all of these kinds of things are going on in our country. We're worried about Meghan and Harry. We're not worried about these kinds of issues, and we're not worried about my relationship with my Creator, my relationship with my neighbor. There's no conversation whatsoever about sin. We just cancel each other. You know, whatever happened to turn the other cheek? Whatever happened to Peter's question, do I have to forgive my neighbor? What if I forgive him 7 times in a day? Is that enough? And then Jesus says, try 70 times 7. You know, like unlimited forgiveness of sins to your neighbor. Paul, esteem your neighbor more highly than yourself. These things don't get talked about at all. And by not talking about them, how is Jesus relevant? And then you throw that problem into the mix of, all right, I'm on television. I get sponsors. This is the way all mass media works, by the way. It is a money-making operation. And the way it works is I own the media, and you come to me as a business person and say, I'm willing to pay X number of $1,000 for a commercial to be aired on your media, but you've got to deliver an audience that makes it worth my while. And with a 1 or 2% response to an advertisement, you better be delivering hundreds of thousands of bodies here in my ad if you want my advertising money. Because if you can't do it, then I'll go somebody that can give me the audience that I need to make it worth my while to pay for advertising. So that's how that goes down. And now I'm going to put Christian worship and Christian teaching into that kind of a competitive, fast turnover market. I need a crowd. How do I get a crowd? You know, I've been fortunate to be in and out of schools my whole life, and I've been around really wonderful teachers. They're not, very often, they're not exciting. You know, like, we have Phil Carey coming. I can tell you that 40 plus years of studying Luther, Phil Carey gets Luther in ways that no one else I've ever known gets Luther. And it's hard, tedious work to get at what is the gospel that Luther discovered. And what he discovered was that God is a loving Father, and he promises us things, and all we have to do is believe him. You know, how does that get presented in a way that is speaking to the deep needs of people? And I think he was trying to get at that in the novel.
Yeah. And I think he hit it.
Yeah, and that, to me, that's kind of like, is this Yeshua, I'm going to say compelling rather than attractive? Like, does he say things that, like, turn the lights on? And that, I mean, that's part of our dilemma is, as people who have chosen to be, you know, the intentional, committed follower of Jesus of Nazareth, obviously it strikes a chord for us. Now, some of it may be, you know, it's like, I was born and raised in the church. You know, it's kind of a habit. You know, I brush my teeth because Mom made me. I eat because, well, I like it and my mother made me. And I go to church because my mother made me. And now I haven't lived under my mother's roof for 50 years, and I see no reason not to keep doing it. You know, so there's that, but there's got to be more. And causes us to have to think. And it's like, why follow Jesus?
And, you know, and that's a lot of the feeling that it's hard to describe. You know, that it is hard. It's not an easy thing to, it's easy for me to feel that, but it's not easy for me to convey that to Joe Schmo, you know, who I don't
your
know.
Daughter.
My daughter.
I mean, you want somebody that's been around
right.
from the good times and the bad times.
Right.
It's like,
right. And I think she feels it from me.
yeah.
You know, but out of the mouth, it's hard.
Because you kind of have to. I mean, the way the human brain works, if Freud's right, is there's a pre-consciousness about who we are that's very active, but only certain things rise to the level of what we're dealing with right here, right now. And I think it was when I was doing the training for 7 Habits that they were talking about the synapses between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And from what I can garner from my teaching is that to testosterone destroys those synapses very early after creation. And the one guy said men are literally brain damaged, and that the male-female brain, one of the differences is the number of the connecting synapses, and that women are able to process a lot more information, a lot more diversified information simultaneously, and men tend to be more linear. You know, these are generalizations, obviously, and that shows itself in A plus B equals C thinking, as opposed to A through Z and therefore F. You know, it's like, but how do you kind of get down into the mix of all that's going on inside you and start making distinctions and separations and highlighting this, you know, this comes first, and then it makes all these things possible.
Makes sense.
I know a lot of stories of people who either because of the folks in their lives or sometimes even their own decisions have really hit the rocks, you know, that and when everybody else walked away, Jesus didn't. And that's a reality that keeps coming up. And I've seen that. I was talking to a driver in Bangalore, India, and you know, it's like everybody, you know, he was the firstborn son, and he had his mother and his wife's mother and a couple of her sisters and his own children, and he got laid off, and there was sickness, and no one would help him except for a cousin showed up with a bag of rice and said, I know that you're a mechanic and a driver, that Christian hospital is hiring, go see this person. And the night before, he was up, couldn't sleep, stood under the stars, and he said, I literally cried, God, if you're there, help me. And the very next interaction that he had was his cousin. And so he went to the hospital and they hired him. And not only did they give him a job, but he let it out that he was kind of desperate about things at home with the sickness and stuff. And a doctor from the hospital went immediately to his house and provided all the medical care and the medicine and all that kind of stuff. And then they had the grounds guy come and line his well, because in the third world, dirty wells, you know, I had a doctor friend and they wanted him to go on a mission trip, and he was like, there's no point, I'm an intern, so I can, you know, diagnose till the cows come home, give the right meds and stuff, and the next time they drink of water, they're sick again. And he goes, fix the wells, and then you can bring doctors in. And so they fixed his well, they took care of his family, they gave him a job. And he's a devout Christian now. He said, when nobody else cared, Jesus did. Mm-hmm. And he was like, okay, that works. You hear that over and over and over again. But in our society, how do you talk about that to people that are like tuned in?
Pray about it.
Well, yeah. Darn, they show up.
Yeah.
When you look at this country and the way I've always been that I always believed that the really smart, the well-educated, the well-versed, worldly traveled eventually would get to these levels where they would be the people that would be running the show. And what I've seen in the last 20, 30 years is not the case. I sometimes wonder if there are any intelligent people at all in the government. And I think here, the people are there was a verse in there, so if a person's hungry, would you give them a rock? And the United States is at that level where they're looking for something, and we keep getting rocks. And even this stimulus check of $14,000, $1,400, excuse me, my goodness, that's $30 a week. And I hate to sit there and think sometimes that if you're going to tell me that a lot of people in this country are in this bad shape, that $30 a week is making a difference in that person's lives, I guess I've been shopping at the wrong supermarkets, buying the wrong clothes and whatever else.
Well, you think about it, somebody loses their job, and the average American's making like $52,000 a year, and you give them $1,400. And the reason they lost their job was you panic over a novel virus, and we're now getting enough data we can look at. It's like Florida and California, and the guy in California, he just keeps doubling down. And the guy in Florida was like, we're going to really try to protect the elderly because they seem to be the hardest hit, and we're not closing the place down. And Florida's doing pretty well.
Yeah.
In California, not so well. And it's like it's brand new, and it's always a panic, but they don't care about the people. I mean, here's the truth: is if you looked at the scripture, and you took made in the image and likeness of God seriously, I think you would be really big into quality education, and I mean that like STEM and reading skills, and some of the things like early on I didn't buy the food, but you told me a story about yourself that made me think, like if you were going to school now, they would have fed you. And it would have made a lot of difference. And yeah, the parents should, but at the end of the day, the kid's sitting there in front of you, he's hungry. And I'm a big believer in, I don't care why the kid is there hungry, feed him. We'll figure the other thing out later. But we spend more money on the teachers' unions than we do on the students. And that needs to be fixed. Education is the way out of poverty. It is the great equalizer, and I can point to two people who are very influential in my life. One of them is Ben Carson. I love his mother. I wished I'd been able to meet her. I met him and his wife, but his mother was illiterate, and she was cleaning homes for a living, and she had a gig where she was cleaning for a university professor in Chicago area, and he got in a conversation with her and kind of stressed, make your boys read, and so every summer she dragged them down to the library, and they did the book club thing and so forth, and she made them write a written report every week. And she would take the report and underline it, and then say things like, read this to me, now explain it. They got into high school, I think, before they learned that she couldn't read, that the whole shtick was she was faking it in order to get them to read.
Mm-hmm.
He turns out to be arguably, certainly among, if not the single best pediatric neurosurgeon ever.
Mm-hmm.
brilliant, off the charts guy. And his brother's an engineer. He's no slouch either. So Carson is an example of really bad situation, and because of active parenting and education, he got out. Another one is a guy named Thomas Sowell, who he's 90-something now, and he's a fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, which is a graduate, what's in the graduate department, the school there, but they get these scholars and they pay them a pretty impressive amount of money. They have no responsibilities other than just to follow what their brain's interested in at the moment. And I saw an interview from a few years back, like 5 years ago, and the interviewer held up a book. It was Thomas Sowell, a basic reader, economics, personality development, political science, about 5 different books. And he said every single one of these, in 3 different academic disciplines, was a runaway national #1 bestseller on the New York Times list. And he said, do you know what they all have in common? And so I go, well, I wrote them. And he goes, yeah, but you wrote them after your 80th birthday. So this guy was born in obviously a black family in North Carolina. His dad died before he was born. His mother died when he was a toddler. The house that he grew up in did not have electricity or indoor plumbing. He was adopted by a great aunt and her 2 adult daughters. They moved with him to Harlem, and when he was in school, a neighbor in the apartment building took him to the library, got him a library card, and got him reading in elementary school. And then when he graduated from elementary school, the same man made sure that he went to a different junior high than the one that he was initially assigned to, because the one was junk and the other one was a good school. And this guy is amazing. And, it's like investing in the other. And, it's not a hard thing. The guy said, come on, we're going to the library. And he took him regularly to the library and put him in a building full of books and said, you can read anything you want. There's a guy up in Canada named Jordan Peterson who's now pretty internationally famous, but he grew up in an oil town in Alberta. And he has developed a writing program, and he's driving it hard because if you can write, you can change the world. And he's driving it hard in an elementary school, investing at that level. It's like, I think Christians need to do that. Yeah. That's how you take people seriously, I think. But all of that revolves around how can you speak about Jesus of Nazareth in a compelling way? And I think for all of us, there is that when all my support got stripped away and I stood there alone and inadequately resourced and not sure how I'm going forward, he was there.
Shows up.
And I think that's how you talk about Jesus to everybody. I think the Baptists try to do that with their salvation stories. My dad used to joke around about, you got to make it really bad in order to make Jesus look really good. And I think a little of that happens. They joke about BC stories, before Christ.
Yeah.
I don't think it has to be bad. I think it has to be real. Because, has anybody not been alone? It's like, doesn't have to be extreme either. All right, so.
Very quickly, the thing we were talking about earlier about what I think what impressed me here in all the reading was when it comes down to the Jesus, I call them the Jesus moments of the healing, and how he did some of these things with the witnesses around. And then at times he would tell people, don't tell anyone about this and whatever else. But the other one that impressed me just as equally was when people had problems and they posed questions to him, the answers he came back with were, to me, very simplistic, but they nailed it to the wall. In other words, there was no way he gave you the answer. You can't come back with 700 more questions. He answered your question to the point, it's over. There it is. You keep that thought in your head, and when you look at it, think, why did I even have to ask that question? Had I been thinking, I would have known that answer. And it was no surprise.
But you didn't, and he did.
And it was always, he was never confounded. He was never confounded by anything where he was left without any words.
Well, there's almost this sense like, we just did last week it was Nicodemus, we were in chapter 3, 14 to 20 or whatever. And sometimes I read that and it's like, Nicodemus comes to you by night and he's asking you these questions, and I'm not sure your answers are like connected to this conversation. I have that feeling every once in a while. But when I really think about it, it's like Jesus really truly hears the person and cuts through all the crap and goes right to the heart of the matter and speaks there. And he does it in conversations, but he does it with parables too. Like the parable of the Good Samaritan. This quibbling about, well, who am I, of all the human beings on the planet, who am I responsible to? And man, that could go in 1,000 directions. And Jesus goes, well, let me tell you a story. There's this guy, and he's making the trip from Jericho up to Jerusalem. And if you want a place where you could get mugged really easy, that's the road, because it winds up this valley, and you go around a corner, and you could literally be a few hundred yards away from somebody, but you just went around a corner and you're out of sight, and it's going to be a while before anybody gets there. A lot of bad stuff can happen to you. And so the guy gets mugged and he's left, and then people come along and we kind of think, well, it's self-righteous, religious, blah blah blah. But if you put it in the context of first century Judaism, the first two guys were engaged in doing their duty to God, which love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It ought to be your number one priority. So, for example, the Levite going up to Jerusalem, presumably to the temple to do his duty, and if he shows up ritually unclean from being around blood and dead and so forth, he can't do what he's supposed to do. And so he chooses to pass by. The fact that it was also a safety measure for him, like my daughter-in-law, she is amazing. All of them are, but there was this guy that was stranded, and she was driving by and stopped and picked him up and took him where he wanted to go, and everybody's like, you picked up a male stranger in the car and so forth. And it's like, they were worried about her safety, but
she wanted to help.
She did the right thing, and so this Samaritan comes along, and I don't know that the average person in the pew realizes the racial animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans, where they would not even allow like a Samaritan shadow to cross over their shadow. They hated each other so much, you know? It's like, I've only had a few enemies in my life, parishioners mostly. But I've never hated anybody that much, you know? And they hated each other. And so for Jesus to cast the hero of the parable as a Samaritan, do you remember were they Barclay? They were Berrigan priests, two brothers, Catholic priests. They poured blood all over the floor down at GE in Philadelphia. And, they produced a book called Quotations from Chairman Jesus, and they were communist, Catholic priests, social agitator, anti-war guys. And when they told the story of the prodigal son, or not the prodigal son, but the Good Samaritan, it was the good Black Panther, because they thought that would cause white America to have something like the shock effect of the Good Samaritan on a Jewish audience from the Second Temple. And you know, when Jesus gets done with that parable, there's literally nothing else to be said. You know, who's my neighbor? The two wealthy rich guys who were the pillars of society, blah blah blah. That you know, they're the kind of people that you could help and they'll help you, and you'll get a good reputation and so forth. And then this guy that you literally think is the scum of the earth comes along and helps you. You know, it's like, it's fun to think about who do I connect with in the parables. You know, like whenever I hear the Good Samaritan, I always connect with the guy that's beat up and left for dead in the ditch. You know, that's me in the story. The leaving the 99 sheep in the wilderness and going after the one. I always view myself as the one. You know, it's like, please come and find me. And Jesus, you know, he speaks to the issue, and at the end he goes, so which one acted like a neighbor?
Right.
And he doesn't even have to say, go thou and do likewise. The one story that's really interesting biblically is the woman caught in adultery. Some of the ancient manuscripts, it's in Luke. Some of them it's in John. Some of them don't have it at all, and it's just like this free-floating story about Jesus. I don't know anybody that thinks it's not true. That, you know, it has the ring of truth to it.
Mm-hmm. And
so it's floated around a little bit within the Christian tradition of like, where's this belong? And it is so Jesus. You know, like this crowd, they got her, you know, blah, blah, blah. He cuts through all of the agendas and all that other kind of stuff. And, you know, that he who is without sin cast the first stone. Amazing.
And it, you know, that to make that relevant to our society and everything today is just came up last night in my household. We're, you know, watching the news, and then, you know, somebody in the room comments, well, that guy's just a butthead. I used a nice word, you know, and it was like, okay, now wait a minute. You got to think of where are they coming from? What's their side of the story? Yeah, you might not agree, but that's not how we're supposed to be, you know.
Yeah.
You know, even though I didn't agree either, it was like, no wait a minute. You know, you don't have to like jump right away to that conclusion.
Given your track record with sin, you should be quiet and gracious.
No, but you know, it's truth, you know. Everybody has.
Now, next week we're close to Mary Magdalene, who is a fascinating character to look at. I will put it up on the church's Facebook page, but there's a site that does these little 5-minute, you know, weird things. Mary Magdalene woman has been used and abused by the church for centuries. You know, the art community is in love with, there's this couple of places where women anoint Jesus' feet either with their tears or with perfume, and then they let their hair down and wipe his feet with the hair. And at one point in time, I think it was Gregory the Great connected 3 different women's stories in the gospel all under it's Mary Magdalene. So there's a little bit of an effort on in the scholastic community to let's figure out who Mary really is and what her connection to Jesus is. And so I thought these guys, I don't think it's a church-related site at all, but they walk through the whole history of it. It would be interesting to take that information and what Wandering does with her. Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, when you sort all of that out, Mary Magdalene at one point in time in herself was the entire Christian church of the world. May have only been for a couple of hours, but you know, she was at the tomb, present for the resurrection, moments after it happened, and she is the first evangelist and the apostle to the apostles. So, I mean, it's like, can't take that away from her. And so it would be interesting to compare this history and the rehabilitation effort with Wandering's version of her. And there's so many people that want her to have been a crazy prostitute, and then they want her to be Jesus's lover, and you know, what did he do in those 30 years? You know, he was married and had 2 kids, and went to India and studied under the Buddha, who was dead for 500 years before he was born, but that's okay. You know, so there's all this wild speculation fueled by an art community. It's like, here you have the perfect human being and the whore. And, you know, as an artist, man, you could do all kinds of things with that. So, we'll take a look at Mary.
Is that today?
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday.
First one? Second one. All right.